welcome. I don't know if anyone's had a chance to look around any of the exhibitions yet, and if this is all fresh to you. We have 3 really exciting exhibitions actually this season. We've got in galleries 3 and 4, which is where we will start, artist Hamid Zanati. In gallery 2, we have Claudia Martinez-Garay. And in the final gallery that we will go into, we have Julian Abraham Togar. Today you'll be guided around by our fantastic community research group, Ubuntu. We have Aaron, Paul and Neela, who will be giving you some wonderful insights. And we also have our wonderful gallery assistant, Millie Quick, as well, who will be talking through on their perspectives. And if everyone's ready, we will start with gallery 3 and 4 with Hamid Zanati's work.
Welcome to Two Steps at a Time, a retrospective on Hamid Zanati's work and life. And I think it's so difficult to chart someone's life. And when you have someone whose art was produced mostly outside of like the institutional art culture, the information about his experiences and the intentions of his work is more diffused. It's less nailed down and pinned in frames. So I think this is the perfect way to explore his life and his work. He was born in Algeria under French colonial rule, and when he came of age, it was the same time that Algeria was achieving independence. He was then a migrant worker. He traveled to Germany, and through all of the obstacles of travel and this sometimes precarious existence, he found ways to keep working, keep making art, bringing it with him and exhibiting it wherever he could. You could say he had a compulsion to make art, but he also had a determination to keep making it. And the really beautiful thing you can start to connect to through all of this huge amount of pieces of work here are the patterns and textures and colors that make up his artistic language. We can compare these to nature that he surrounded himself with, the Saharan desert, the sea, also, the streets of Algiers. You can see it all echoed in there, but also cultural symbols, shapes and patterns from his own background and his own inventions. So there's a lot to unpack. And I think the testament to someone who had to make art despite everything, and who wasn't celebrated enough in his life. We're just so lucky that the curators have been able to work with his estate and those who knew him and loved him and try and communicate just a bit of what he was about.
Good afternoon. My name is Neela. When I walked through this exhibition and this one, I kind of felt it reminded me of this Sufi chant that I learnt during my sound healing training. And my colleagues suggested that I start off with the chant when I sang it to them. So it's a Sufi chant, and it's very beautiful. And the words, actually, there's kind of a couple of translations. It could be, "O divinity, I yearn for your beauty," or "Divine God, appear, my beloved." So it goes like this. Jamila la, Jamila Jamila la, Jamila la, Ishka la Jamil. Jamila la, Jamil Allah. Ishka la Jamil. Jamila la Jamil Allah. Ishka la Jamil. Ishka la Jamil. Ishka la Jamil. Hamid's work really transports me into a different dimension. I was kind of looking at his history, and he would probably been going through like a really difficult and challenging time during the colonial period, and then moving to another country and then another country afterwards. So it was kind of I'd imagine some very dark points in his life that he might have experienced. And yet, when you look at all his work, it's just so bright and colourful and really kind of striking. It doesn't feel like there's any darkness in his work and his symbols and patterns and mark making. There's something really kind of playful about his work, but each piece is just so beautifully unique in how it kind of comes across. There's no two pieces that look the same or alike. The color scheme's very similar, but again, it's just so beautiful how he has recycled old ceramics and put his mark on all those amazing ceramic pieces that we see in this space. And the mark making is just very playful and happy and alive and flowing everywhere. I feel a lot of emotion coming through every single piece. There's also kind of a vibrancy in his work. I love how each piece kind of has its own energetic frequency and vibration, leaving us to interpret it to our own imagination, because colors vibrate just like sounds vibrate. And so every single piece is vibrating a different frequency, a different color, a different energy. And it really kind of draws you into each piece. And in some ways I feel quite saddened that he wasn't alive to see this in some ways. I'm sure they are with us in spirit and witnessing this beautiful legend that they've left behind. So
I'm going to sort of focus on certain aspects that caught my attention when I was sort of looking at this wonderful work of Hamid. The word Sahara Desert jumped out at me, and I'll explain why. when you look at the term Sahara, in reality, the term actually means Great Desert. So in effect, when we say Sahara Desert, what we're saying is, Great Desert. And it was scholars such as, Joseph Ben Jochannan who actually picked up on those points, in terms of, the history, of the African continent. Scientists, back in the sort of 70s, 1970s, 80s, they actually, through the use of satellite, they actually, could sort of detect that beneath the sands of the Sahara were originally rivers were actually flowing under the sand, probably going back, thousands of years. And they've traced cultures that go back around 200,000 years ago. And you're talking about a region that was once green. So, there was a lot flourishing, back during those times. And in more recent times, some event took place maybe sometime, maybe over 10,000 years ago, which resulted in, the area becoming deforested, and eventually you're left with sand. Just imagine, what was taking place back then, and what people were doing. Because if we relate it back to, Hamid's work, I would say that, Hamid would have been inspired by those who came before. The Bedouins, according to Dr. Mia Schneider, Bedouins, they've actually got brilliant eyesight, and they can see for miles, and they can see detail, along with the San people who are further south on the African continent, the so-called bush people, and also the Aborigines. They're renowned for their eyesight. And the point I like to make is that through the fact that they can see such detail, I would say that Hamid's work, because the colours are so absolutely outstanding, and that's what catches my eyes, the actual colours, and the actual depth of the colours, because these are the kind of colours you don't see every day. You might see reds, but these kind of reds and the pinks and the greens, the blues, yellows, it's on another level. And as Neela highlighted, all colours, just like everything, vibrate at a particular frequency. When it comes to, because Hamid talks about symbols, and when it comes to symbols, I know that symbols are something that is actually very much a part of the way of life of Africans, from north, south, east and west, as far as the continent. But I've noticed that outside of the African continent, across the world, symbols, they seem to, in some cases, they might not have the same meaning, but you can see, there's clearly a connection. As you can see, a lot of, like circles, rectangles, what I would say like trapezium shapes have actually been used. And for me, when it comes to the circles are like sort of symbolic or metaphorical representations of feminine energy. And when you come to sort of rectangular shapes, square shapes, those are like masculine energy. So and you can see quite clearly that it's being used very, very often.
Claudia's work, even though, as we're going to talk about, there's a lot of themes of loss and maybe even grief, there's still a playfulness in it that I think reflects both of the other exhibitions. So Claudia's personal story involves a process of going to European museums, British museums, asking to see, where's your Peruvian section? and repeatedly being told, those artifacts are archived, they're not visible, they're not on display. And then continuing this theme, when she was able to find the artifacts, they would be given very little information. A lot of them have guesses at when they're from, guesses at what area they're from, guesses at their use and meaning. If later you pick up one of our information sheets, you can look at the listings for all of the artifacts that are reproduced in this piece, and you can see how some of them there's just barely anything there, and a lot of these things just reduce to a number, basically. So there is a sense of loss here. There's a sense of a pre-Columbian history that has been disappeared, that has been looted and appropriated and lost to some extent. But I think with this piece, there is a resistance, there is a kind of frame breaking again. And by having everything in this one mound, as a viewer, we're really forced to explore. We've really got to search. We've got to engage with what we're seeing. And in a way, it's very messy, but that gives it more of an air of reality than the kind of static, framed exhibitions we might be used to. When we look at this pile of soil, it could be a mountain in the Andes. It could be an excavated burial mound. This is a geography that would be unfamiliar to many visitors, so it can help evoke that landscape as well as that history, as well as these replicas of what could be funerary objects or offerings that are images of local wildlife, the bones of which could be found in these mounds as well, could have been made as offerings.
As far as Claudia's work, because right from the outset, I thought, right, I'm going to speak, say a few words about, Claudia's work. Yeah, the term ghost kingdom, jumped out at me, and what it kind of left me thinking, wow, it's like, something's been taken away, and it's almost like, the spirits are saying, well, return whatever's been, because it's been highlighted that, there's been, was a lot of looting during the colonial era. So for me, really, I kind of relate the situation in Peru to other parts of the world where there's been similar looting, and the British Museum, for example. I mean, it's not the only museum that's holding these items, but it stands out in my mind because I remember sort of going on field trips as part of courses that I've attended. And I've noted that the British Museum is divided up into sections. You've got like what they describe as Africa, and they've got Egypt and what have you. And I'm thinking, well, as far as the course that I was on, it was actually an African history course, and was the sort of real history, not sort of any kind of nonsense. But Egypt, if we look on a map, is actually part of the African continent. And then there are other sort of sections like, Mexico and etc. The thing is, this particular exhibition, it's it really kind of illustrates the point that even though there has been the looting, because I see this as a symbolic of beneath the soil, there's evidence of sort of civilizations, cultures that go back how many thousands of years, and I see the fact that these artifacts are kind of protruding through the soil, and it's kind of rising to the surface, So it kind of leaves a sense of hope, because the fact that during the colonial era, it was a case of trying to sort of, suppress, the ways of life of, the people of this particular region, and trying to sort of control the way they live, and get them to forget about their history, their culture, their names, etc. But at some point, various individuals have been inspired, to actually reclaim, their history, and I think this is a very good way of, sort of presenting, the material. So as far as like because the reference was made to like pre-Columbian knowledge, and from what I've gathered, because when you use the term pre-Columbian, it's making reference to Christopher Columbus. And the thing is, when we use terms such as that, because we have to use that particular term, because otherwise, if you start using other terms, people won't know what you're talking about. So it's the period before 1492. The thing is, there was trading, there's evidence of trading across the Atlantic, going back thousands of years. Again, there was like, ships built on the African continent, and Africans were sailing backwards and forwards, according to evidence presented by the late Dr. Ivan van Sertima in African presence in early America. And they actually landed in South America, where like Peru is, and like the central part of America, where Mexico, and there's a lot of evidence to support that, because there's linguistic evidence, archaeological evidence, historical evidence. So I kind of, all this kind of resonates with me in terms of what's happening with Peru.
So this is Reconciliation. Togar here has curated a space that is an exhibition, but more than that, it's an event space, a community space, a place to archive and perform. And I think so many galleries allow us to they give us permission to do things that might be awkward in normal life. Often galleries let us actively look in a way we might not every day, but in an exhibition like this, there's lots of active listening and even active performing. Togar thought a lot about the meaning and activity of being a host or being a guest, and perhaps the way those roles can change around. These kinetic sculptures at the back, I think they're really marvelous. And the way that they're always making a sound, even though it can be kind of disruptive, it also means if you come in here as a visitor and you're a bit shy about picking up one of the instruments and having a go yourself, well, there's already a sound. You don't have to break the silence. You can jump in there. And already I've seen all sorts of people playing instruments that they're experienced with or not so experienced with. I've even had a go myself. It is very fun. There's a kind of meditation one can enact in this space. Not always like a peaceful meditation, but like a connection, an active connection to the space, to the people who are with us. And in this way, I think when visitors come and they play music, or they take part in an activity, or they meditate, they are taking up an authority. It's no longer a space where the only authority is the artist or maybe the staff. We all become co-artists, which I think is really important and powerful. And that also really helps make an exhibition memorable. Because in my experience, when you go and you see a very beautiful piece of art, if it's only engaging one sense, it is quite possible to lose that memory. But if you go to a place and you do something and you make choices and you communicate with people, you create a story, and that's so much easier to remember.
What obviously stands out from this exhibition is sound. And what I want to say is that sound, as with the colours, it vibrates at various frequencies. And it can actually, sounds can evoke certain emotions. Sounds can also, bring about, a state of, meditations, as was mentioned before. And it can actually, if you like, transport you back into the past, and also it's possible to, transport you into the future. The main one that I want to talk about is the piano. The piano is actually known, to actually originate from, a combination of the harp and the finger piano, which is, found on the African continent. So it was a case of it was combined together in Europe to form what we know as the piano today. There is a thread that runs through the fabric of all the work that we're seeing today. For example, is mention made of the colonial era and the fact that knowledge, ways of living, sound was actually, suppressed. However, there were those who were inspired, and through their creativity, they've reached back to times gone by in the ancient world and used it as a propelling force to move them into the future.
Hello guys, yes, my name is Aaron. I'm also part of Ubuntu. So again, just to kind of let you know that you've probably heard of Ubuntu, not sure what that is. We're part of a project with Nottingham Contemporary. Part of the work we do is research and look at accessibility for the arts. So that's what we're about, and we're working with Contemporary now for a few years, so it's very well. So that's why we're part of this work. We're just trying to get people involved, give a different perspective on some of the exhibitions that you've seen so far. What I'd like to do is I'm going to just start by pointing out at the top over here on the right side. You can see the word Bismillah. And that's a word that's come across from Togo, and it actually means, in translation, it means in the name of God, and it kind of means more so that in the name of God I do this. So it kind of sets the precedent and the grounding for any work that takes place. I just want to acknowledge that as we come into this space and come into this exhibition. Also on the themes, big theme again in here is collaboration. So, that's something that's come across strongly from Togo, and something that he wants to be taking place through this exhibition and ongoing. It's something also that is talked about is jamming. It's a big theme as well. So the whole theme of jamming, and we'll touch on that in a minute. But obviously, why he's been here prior to the exhibitions, and he's spent some time in Nottingham, and he's actually done some jamming sessions with local musicians and different peoples, even the youth orchestra. He's done some stuff with them as well. So that's what this exhibition aims to encourage, that interaction and that jamming and that free flow. So again, just please be inspired to join in as you feel. Just letting you know something else that came through is call and response. So it's another theme of Togo's kind of work, and it has very many meanings, and it can be a political thing, many different dimensions to it. But this drum that I've got here is a djembe drum. It's an African drum, and it's used very much in African folk tradition. And a big part of that is a call and response thing. So. Bam, bam, bam. Bam, bam, bam. Bam, bam, bam. continuation of Togar's work. He sees it as an ongoing thing. It's a living, active exhibition. So, and on his studio, he's got OK Studios, which is an ongoing thing as well. So, it's not static. Please, you are welcome to interact and be part of this exhibition. Don't worry about your level of musicianship or anything like that. Just get involved, think up, make some stuff, and engage and be part of this living exhibition. So, thank you guys.